The first victory of the Hashashin was not a corpse on a road. It was a heartbeat. It was the instant a vizier, a prince, or a conqueror understood that walls were no longer enough. Armies could be counted, fortresses could be measured, supply lines could be cut. But what do you do with an enemy who enters the mind before he enters the room? What do you do with men who do not need to destroy your army if they can teach your generals to fear their own servants, their own guards, even the stranger asking for alms at the gate? That was the true genius of the Nizari Ismailis, whom their enemies turned into legend, and Europe later remembered under the blunt, dark word, assassins. Their sharpest blade was not steel, it was anticipation. To understand why they became so feared, you have to begin where power usually hides. Not in the open field, but on a mountain path, in a fortress that looked less like a palace than an idea carved into stone. Subscribe to the channel, like and share this video. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story. Alamut, the eagle's nest. In 1090, Hassan the Sabah, the austere and brilliant leader of the Persian Nizaris, took control of that stronghold not by smashing it to rubble, but by conversion, planning, and silent penetration. Their state was born the way it would fight, patiently, asymmetrically, with nerves harder than iron. They were too small to defeat the Seljuk Empire in conventional war, too exposed to survive by open battle, and too committed to vanish quietly. So they built something rarer than a kingdom. They built a distributed fortress state whose frontiers were not lines on a map, but nodes of loyalty. Castles in mountains, cells in cities, preachers, agents, scholars, farmers, craftsmen, and, when necessary, fidais, the devoted ones willing to kill or die for the community. That is the first myth to strip away. The Hashashin were not merely a gang of ecstatic murderers darting from shadow to shadow. They were a religious and political movement, a branch of Nizari Ismaili Shi'i Islam born from a succession crisis in the Fatimid world. They believed rightful spiritual authority passed through the line of Imam Nizar and his descendants. In Ismaili thought, the Imam was not just an administrator. He was the living guide to inner truth, the interpreter who could unveil meanings hidden beneath the literal shell of revelation. Their faith trained the mind to see layers, the visible and the concealed, the outer law and the inner meaning, the public form and the secret structure. It is no accident that a community shaped by such thought became masters of hidden architecture in politics, propaganda, and war. Enemies later claimed these men were drugged with hashish, seduced by false gardens of paradise, then unleashed as obedient weapons. Those stories spread because they were useful. They transformed disciplined courage into a carnival of exotic madness. Modern scholarship has been devastating to these tales. Contemporary hostile Muslim sources are notably silent about systematic drugging, and the most lurid versions flowered later through rumor, crusader retellings, and literary imagination. The truth is less theatrical and more unsettling. Men can become terrifyingly resolute without narcotics when belief, identity, discipline, persecution, and purpose fuse into one hard point. Life inside the Nizari world did not resemble fantasies of drunken cult banquets. Hassan-i Sabah himself became famous for severity. Sources describe him as ascetic, strict, even ruthless toward his own household. Alamut was not a playground. It was a machine for survival. The Nizari state in Iran and Syria lived encircled by stronger enemies, and therefore required order. Castles had granaries, cisterns, storehouses, and careful defenses. Mountain fortresses were not simply nests for killers. They were administrative centers, libraries, treasuries, workshops, and symbols. Villages around them fed the heights. A fadai could strike fear into a court, but only a functioning polity could preserve a community over generations. So how did they recruit? Not, as legend would have it, by simply scooping up boys and hypnotizing them. Recruitment began in the long, patient labor of dawah, the mission. Ismaili missionaries worked through persuasion, network building, kinship, protection, and the appeal of belonging to a disciplined cause in an age of fractured authority. In regions ground between ambitious empires, sectarian hostility, predatory governors, and tribal conflict, the Nizari message offered both cosmic meaning and practical refuge. A recruit might first encounter not a dagger, but an argument, a teacher, a trusted friend, a small circle that spoke about justice, legitimacy, hidden knowledge, and loyalty to the rightful imam. Not every recruit became a fighter, and not every fighter became a fidai. The Nizari state needed farmers to keep terraces alive, scribes to preserve correspondence, builders to repair walls, couriers to cross hostile ground, and da'is to spread the mission. But the men remembered by enemies were the select operatives tasked with precision violence. Their preparation was less about frenzied combat and more about self-command, patience, secrecy, endurance, nerve. The ability to wait, to blend, to study patterns, to carry a role so completely that suspicion slid off the skin. If there was elite training, its most dangerous component was probably psychological. Learning to master fear in close quarters, to accept death, and to remain focused on a single political purpose. Their weapons reflected the nature of their missions. The iconic tool was the dagger. A short blade is intimate. It denies distance. It demands access, timing, and commitment. That choice was strategic as much as practical. A public close-range killing was a message. We reached the protected man himself. We stood near enough to hear him breathe. We did not need a battlefield or a volley of arrows. In some accounts, their men used disguise, religious costume, servant roles, or long periods of infiltration to approach a target. Whether every tale is true matters less than the pattern. The Hashashin made proximity terrifying. They converted personal security into theater, then shattered the audience. This was political violence as language. Their attacks were rarely random massacres. They aimed upward. Viziers, governors, generals, rival clerics, princes, and enemies whose death could fracture a campaign or stop a persecution. Their most famous early success came in 1092, with the killing of the Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk, one of the most powerful statesmen in the Islamic world. The act announced a brutal equation. A community too small for open war could still reach the brain of an empire. You could crush villages, besiege castles, and curse them from pulpits. But if your most valuable advisor could be stabbed on the road, then the cost of destroying them rose sharply. That was the strategic miracle of the order. They turned weakness into leverage. In a conventional contest, they were outnumbered, often isolated, and vulnerable. Yet by making elite individuals feel individually vulnerable, they imposed caution on powers far larger than themselves. Some opponents began traveling with layers of guards. Some reportedly wore chainmail beneath their robes. Some suspected servants, petitioners, and holy men. Fear spread faster than armies. The Nizaris learned that a ruler who checks every shadow has already surrendered a portion of his freedom. They were also fortress tacticians. Western imagination often reduces them to rooftop knifemen, but their survival depended on stone, terrain, and logistics. Alamut and its sister fortresses in Iran were positioned in difficult mountain environments. These strongholds were chosen and improved not for splendor, but for resilience. Water, food, angles of approach, communication, and local support mattered. Against superior armies, a mountain castle can multiply the will of a small garrison. If they could not own plains, they would own height. If they could not raise massive field armies, they would force their enemies to spend men, time, and morale against stone. This is where daily life becomes important. Imagine the rhythm. Dawn over cold ridges, storage checks, watch rotations, repair of walls, saddles, ropes, blades, study circles on doctrine, quiet meals, messages encoded or hidden, children growing up with the idea that the mountain was not merely home, but testimony. Women, families, laborers, local allies, and religious teachers all existed within or around this world, though hostile chronicles often erase them in favor of a single, lurid image: the killer. But a state cannot endure on daggers alone. It endures on bread, water, records, trust, and the ability to make ordinary routine feel like sacred defense. Their religion deepened this discipline. The Nizari Ismailis were Shi'i Muslims, with a distinctive emphasis on the living imam and on ta'wil, the inner interpretation of revelation. In a brutal age, that gave the community more than doctrine. It gave them a map of meaning. If history looked chaotic, it was not meaningless. If persecution came, it was not random. Loyalty, concealment when necessary, obedience, and endurance could all be integrated into a sacred worldview. The strongest fighters in history are rarely those who simply love violence. The most durable are those who can explain suffering to themselves in a way that strengthens cohesion rather than shatters it. Did they have rituals? Yes, but not the lurid carnival imagined by enemies. Oaths of loyalty mattered. Transmission of doctrine mattered. Hierarchy mattered. The line between spiritual allegiance and political obedience was not easily separated. There were also practices of concealment, because secrecy was not style for them. It was a condition of survival. In periods when the imam was hidden, the faithful learned to live with layered identities and guarded speech. Outsiders saw mystery and imagined sorcery. Often, it was simply disciplined community behavior shaped by mortal pressure. The Syrian branch added another dimension to their legend. In the 12th century, the Nizaris established themselves in Syrian fortresses, most famously Masyaf, and under Rashid al-Din Sinan, later distorted into the Old Man of the Mountain, their name grew even darker in Crusader and Muslim eyes. Syria amplified the order's reputation because it placed them inside one of the most narrated conflict zones of the medieval world. Every rumor could now travel along trade routes, pilgrim roads, and military camps. Then came the episodes that hardened their myth into metal. Saladin himself, the great unifier and conqueror, reportedly faced multiple Nizari assassination attempts. One of the most famous stories tells of a dagger and warning note left near him while he slept, a message more chilling than an actual wound because it demonstrated access. Some details remain debated, as medieval stories often are, but the enduring point is clear. Even a giant of the age had to negotiate with the possibility that unseen enemies could touch him inside his guarded circle. That is not mere violence. That is strategic theater performed against the psychology of power. Another thunderclap came in 1192, when Conrad of Montferrat, newly chosen king of Jerusalem, was killed by 2 Nizari operatives in Tyre. The act shook the Crusader world. Who had ordered it? Why then? Whose interests aligned with it? Medieval politics rarely offered clean answers, which made the murder even more destabilizing. The Hashashin did not only remove a man. They inserted poison into diplomacy by making everyone ask who had whispered to who had paid who might be next. Precision killing, when fused with uncertainty, can fracture alliances long after blood dries. It is tempting to imagine them as unbeatable shadows, but that would repeat the error of their enemies in reverse. They were formidable, not invincible. They failed, too. Some missions miscarried. Some castles were pressured into compromise. Their leaders had to negotiate, maneuver, and survive. Their greatest victories were often negative victories, not being exterminated, not being absorbed, not allowing a larger state to convert overwhelming force into a clean, final solution. For a minority polity under siege, that kind of victory is the most meaningful kind. And what of battle? The popular mind wants scenes of elite shock troops breaking enemy lines. The Nizaris were not famous for that. Their brilliance lay elsewhere. They won by changing the terms of conflict. They survived sieges others expected to finish them. They used mountain fortresses, intelligence, diplomacy, terror, and selective killing to offset military inferiority. Their battlefield innovation was that they refused to fight only on the battlefield. They carried war into psychology, administration, and ritual space. When your enemy's governor fears the mosque, the corridor, the audience hall, and the road equally, then the battlefield has followed him home. That does not mean they were gentle. Medieval politics was soaked in exemplary cruelty, and the Hashashin operated within that world. Their violence was close, intentional, and symbolic. They understood spectacle. A target killed publicly, before witnesses, could echo further than 100 nameless dead on a frontier. They understood timing. To strike during political transition, campaign planning, or succession crisis could multiply the effect. They understood restraint, too, which is often more frightening than fury. To kill only the one who mattered suggested control, intelligence, and confidence. It told rulers, we are not raging, we are selecting. Their enemies feared them for more than their blade. They feared the possibility of invisible loyalty networks. A fortress can be besieged, but how do you besiege belief? How do you storm a doctrine carried in memory, preached in whispers, transmitted through kinship, and anchored to an imam hidden yet present in the life of the mind? That is why hostile chroniclers so often reached for fantasies. The sober explanation that a disciplined minority, driven by theology and sharpened by siege conditions, had created a rational method of asymmetric survival was too uncomfortable. It forced empires to admit that terror was not magic. It was method. Inside the order, courage likely looked less romantic than later legend suggests. It looked like hunger, waiting, study, coded travel, and the uncertainty of never knowing whether the letter would arrive, the contact would remain loyal, or the disguise would hold one more hour. It looked like young men told that their lives mattered only when aligned to a cause greater than appetite. It looked like elders who knew that one reckless strike could trigger massacres against entire communities. Real clandestine violence is built on repetition, discipline, and the cold mathematics of consequence. Hassani Sabah looms over all of this not because he swung a sword on every wall, but because he set the tone. He represents the fusion of ideologue, organizer, missionary, and state builder. Capturing Alamut in 1090 was a masterstroke, but holding and multiplying that base mattered more. His regime's austerity was not cosmetic. It broadcast a message inward and outward. This community would not survive by luxury.
Later stories about paradise gardens flourish precisely because they contrast so starkly with the image preserved in more sober accounts. An iron leader, a disciplined fortress, a movement living with very little margin for softness. The fall, when it came, was not caused by a failure of nerve, but by scale. The Mongol storm under Hulogu was a different order of threat. Mountain fortresses that could torment Seljuk and regional enemies faced a machine of conquest willing to grind through whole systems. In 1256, Alamut fell after the Mongol campaign against the Nizari strongholds in Iran. Other castles surrendered or were reduced. Libraries were lost. The political structure that had made their method possible was broken. Once the fortress state was dismantled, the order as a military power could not continue in the same form. And yet even here, the ending refuses simplicity. The Nizari Ismailis did not vanish into smoke. The community survived beyond Alamut, adapting through concealment, dispersion, and transformation. The military aura dimmed, but the religious lineage continued. That survival is its own answer to every legend. The Hashashin were feared not because they were monsters outside history, but because they were astonishingly inside it. A persecuted minority that turned conviction, organization, terrain, and symbolic violence into a shield sharp enough to cut empires for nearly 2 centuries. So what made them a dreadful weapon? Not one thing. Not drugs, not exotic mystery. It was the fusion. A compelling belief system, legitimation through the imam, ruthless strategic patience, fortresses chosen like equations, operatives willing to endure proximity to death, precision instead of waste, psychological pressure instead of theatrical slaughter. They understood something modern states still rediscover with alarm. If you cannot match power in volume, attack it in confidence. Make leaders doubt their reach, their safety, their servants, their future. Fear then does the marching for you. And that is why their story still bites. Because beneath the robes, the daggers, the mountains, and the legends lies an unnerving lesson about power itself. Armies want to be seen. Empires want to be recognized. The Hashashin mastered the opposite. They built in silence, struck with selectivity, and let the victim's imagination finish the work. Their greatest raid was not against a palace gate, it was against certainty. They entered the inner chamber where rulers keep the illusion that control is solid, then left it cracked. So if you want the final image, do not picture a madman leaping from a tower in a haze of narcotic bliss. Picture a lamp burning in a mountain room, a teacher bending over a text, a courier arriving breathless through snow, a cistern checked before dawn, a young devotee learning that obedience is heavier than armor, a ruler in silk touching the hidden mail beneath his robe, and somewhere between those 2 rooms, a road no one can fully guard. That road is where the order lived, not in myth, but in the terrible space between fear and discipline, where a small people discovered that the shortest blade in history can cast one of the longest shadows. One reason they inspired such terror was that they could attack time itself. A campaign depends on schedule, confidence, momentum. Kill a vizier before a march,
a governor before taxes are collected, a commander before reinforcements assemble, and whole operations stumble. This is why their victories often looked invisible from a distance. No banners captured, no field drenched with cavalry, no triumphant trumpet. Only delay, hesitation, mistrust, and suddenly a stronger enemy behaving like a wounded animal, snapping at shadows and bleeding authority with every nervous decision. Subscribe to the channel, like and share this video. Thank you, and see you in the next stories.